There are places in the Northern Territories where winter arrives not as a season, but as a kind of erasure. The landscape empties, the light withdraws. What remains is a silence so absolute it feels architectural, as though the land itself has become a vault. In the winter of 1983, something disappeared into that vault. Not a person, though a person was involved. Not a structure, though structures were left behind. What vanished was context. The ability to understand what had occurred. The case file that follows is not a mystery in the traditional sense. It is a collection of contradictions held together by geography and weather. It was opened in late January of that year and has never been formally closed. The subject is a man named Elias Morrow, a hydrological cartographer employed by a federal land survey division that no longer exists. He was 41 years old at the time of the incident. He had no family. No known associates outside of professional contacts. No history of instability or erratic behavior. He was, by all accounts, methodical. His work required precision. His colleagues described him as quiet but competent. Unremarkable in the way that competence often is. The file begins with a report filed by a bush pilot named Drummond, who had been contracted to deliver supplies to a remote monitoring station along the upper stretches of a river system that feeds into the Mackenzie Basin. The station was part of a network established to track water flow and ice formation in regions where infrastructure was being considered but not yet built. It was a temporary installation meant to operate for 2 winters and then be dismantled. Elias Morrow had been stationed there alone since mid-November. His role was to collect data, maintain the equipment, and transmit weekly reports via shortwave radio. The station itself was minimal. A prefabricated shelter, a generator, a radio mast, and a small auxiliary shed for fuel and storage. It sat on a low ridge overlooking a frozen expanse that had once been a glacial lake, but had long since drained into a series of shallow basins and marshland. The nearest road was 70 kilometers to the south. The nearest settlement, a logging outpost that operated sporadically, was more than twice that distance. When Drummond arrived on the morning of January 23rd, he found the station intact. The door to the main shelter was closed, but not locked. The generator was off. The radio mast was undamaged. There were no visible signs of disturbance. But Elias Morrow was not there. Inside the shelter, everything appeared orderly. His bunk was made. His personal effects were arranged on a narrow shelf above the desk where he kept his logs. The logbooks themselves were present, filled with entries in his small, precise handwriting. The final entry was dated January 18th, 5 days before Drummond's arrival. It read simply, "Ice depth consistent, wind northeast, temperature stable, no anomalies." There was no indication that he had intended to leave. His winter gear was still hanging on a peg near the door. His boots were beside the bunk. The food supplies were sufficient. The fuel reserves were adequate. The radio, when tested, functioned without issue. Drummond radioed the regional office immediately. A search was initiated within 48 hours. What followed was not a rescue operation in any meaningful sense. It was an exercise in documentation, an attempt to reconstruct not what had happened, but what had failed to happen. The search teams found tracks, they found equipment, they found notes, but they did not find Elias Morrow. And the more they searched, the less the evidence cohered into anything resembling an explanation. The case file grew dense with observations that led nowhere, theories that collapsed under scrutiny, testimonies that contradicted one another not in substance, but in implication. It became, over time, a case defined not by what was discovered, but by what remained unresolved. This is the file on Elias Morrow. It is not a story with an ending. It is a record of absence. A document that describes the shape of something missing, The investigation concluded officially in late March of that year, but the file was never sealed. It remains open not because new evidence is expected, but because closure was never achieved. What follows is drawn from that file, from the reports filed by searchers and investigators, from interviews conducted with those who had known him, however briefly, from the logs he left behind, and from the landscape itself, which offers no answers but insists through its silence that something occurred. The region where Elias Morrow was stationed is not marked on most maps. It exists in the administrative records of hydrological surveys and geological assessments, but it has no name that anyone uses. The locals, those few who live and work in the broader area, refer to it simply as the upper basin. It is a place defined by what it lacks. There are no roads, no trails that lead anywhere intentional, no structures except those erected temporarily and then abandoned. The landscape is flat in a way that suggests not openness but monotony. It is the kind of terrain that exhausts perception. The eye searches for variation and finds none. In winter, it becomes even more featureless. Snow covers the low scrub and marsh grasses. The frozen basins reflect nothing. The horizon disappears into a pale gradient of white and grey. Visibility, even on clear days, is deceptive. Distances are difficult to judge. What appears close can be hours away on foot. What seems far can be reached in minutes. The land plays tricks not through malice, but through its own indifference to scale. The monitoring station was established in the autumn of 1982 as part of a broader initiative to assess the feasibility of constructing a seasonal access road through the region. The road was never built. The initiative was abandoned due to budget constraints and shifting priorities within the department. But the monitoring stations remained in operation through that first winter. There were 3 of them, spaced at intervals along the river system. Each was staffed by a single technician. Communication between stations was maintained via radio, though contact was irregular. The work was isolating by design. It required long stretches of solitude and a tolerance for environmental monotony. Elias Morrow had been selected for the assignment based on his experience and his apparent lack of objection to isolation. His employment file indicates that he had worked on similar projects in remote locations. He had spent time in the Yukon, in northern Alberta, and along the coast of Hudson Bay. He had no dependents, no fixed address beyond a post office box in Yellowknife. He owned no property. His financial records were sparse but unremarkable. He paid his taxes. He maintained a small savings account. He had no debts. He was, in the language of bureaucracy, a suitable candidate for remote deployment. The station itself was a modular unit manufactured by a contractor in Edmonton. It measured roughly 4 meters by 6 meters and was insulated for extreme cold. Inside, there was a sleeping area, a workstation, and a small galley with a propane stove. The generator, housed in a separate enclosure, provided power for the radio equipment and a single electric heater. Water was obtained by melting snow. Waste was stored in sealed containers and removed during supply runs. The station was designed to be functional, not comfortable. It was a place to work, not to live. Elias Morrow had been there for just over 2 months when the incident occurred. His supply schedule was coordinated with the other 2 stations. A bush pilot, usually Drummond, would make a circuit every 3 weeks, delivering food, fuel, and any necessary equipment. The flights were weather-dependent. Delays were common. On his previous visit in early January, Drummond had noted nothing unusual. Morrow had been his typical self. Quiet but efficient. He had helped load the empty fuel canisters and handed over his latest data logs without comment. The exchange had lasted less than 20 minutes. Drummond had not lingered. The weather was turning, and he had 2 more stops to make before returning to base. The landscape surrounding the station offered little in the way of landmarks. To the east, a line of low hills marked the edge of the basin. To the west, the frozen marshland stretched for kilometers before transitioning into boreal forest. To the north, the terrain sloped gently downward toward the remnants of the old glacial lake, now a vast depression filled with ice and wind-scoured snow. To the south, the ridge on which the station sat descended into a shallow valley, where sparse stands of stunted spruce grew in tight clusters. It was not a place where one could easily become lost, provided one remained oriented. But orientation, in such a landscape, required constant attention. There were no trails to follow, no natural paths. The snow covered everything uniformly, erasing any sense of direction that might be derived from the ground itself. Navigation depended on instruments, on maps, on deliberate calculation. Elias Morrow was trained in such navigation. His work required him to venture short distances from the station to take measurements and collect samples. He carried a compass, a handheld radio, and emergency supplies. He followed protocols. He marked his routes. He did not take unnecessary risks. The climate during that winter had been stable. Temperatures hovered between -20 and -30 degrees Celsius. There had been no severe storms, no sudden weather events that might account for disorientation or accident. The days were short, sunrise occurring around 10 in the morning and sunset by mid-afternoon. The light, when it came, was thin and indirect. The nights were long and dark, broken only by the occasional aurora or the cold glitter of stars. It was a season that demanded routine, a structure imposed against the formlessness of time. Morrow's logs reflect that structure. Each day follows a pattern. Wake at 7, check the generator, transmit a brief status report via radio, conduct field measurements, return to the station, prepare food, record observations, sleep. The entries are terse, functional. They reveal nothing of his internal state, no reflections, no complaints, no deviations from the task at hand. It is the record of someone who has learned to live within limits, who has accepted isolation as a condition of the work. The other 2 stations in the network were staffed by men with similar backgrounds. One, located 40 kilometers to the northeast, was occupied by a man named Keller. The other, 60 kilometers to the southwest, was staffed by a man named Voss. Communication between the 3 was infrequent but cordial. They exchanged brief radio messages every few days, mostly to confirm that equipment was functioning and that no assistance was needed. There was no social interaction beyond this. No camaraderie. The distance between them was too great and the work too consuming. Keller would later report that his last contact with Morrow had been on January 16th, 2 days before Morrow's final log entry. The conversation had been brief. Morrow had reported normal conditions and signed off without elaboration. Voss had not spoken to Morrow in over a week. He noted that this was not unusual. They operated on different schedules and contact was voluntary. The regional office in Yellowknife maintained a log of radio transmissions, but these were perfunctory. Status updates, equipment issues, weather reports. There was no indication of distress, no request for assistance, no hint that anything was amiss. The basin itself has a history, though it is not a history that is widely known. The area was once part of a larger network of lakes and rivers that drained the surrounding uplands. Over thousands of years, the drainage patterns shifted. The lakes dried, the rivers changed course. What remained was a landscape in transition, caught between what it had been and what it was becoming. Indigenous groups had passed through the region, following seasonal game routes, but they had not settled there. It was too exposed, too resource poor. Later, during the era of fur trading, a few trappers had worked the area, but they left no permanent mark. A trapper's cabin, long since collapsed, had been noted on older maps, but its exact location was uncertain. In the 1930s, a geological survey team had traversed the basin, searching for mineral deposits. They found nothing of value. Their report, filed and forgotten, described the region as barren and inhospitable. By the time Elias Morrow arrived, the basin was known only to those whose work required them to know it. It was a place that existed on the margins of attention, recorded in documents but absent from experience. It was, in many respects, the ideal location for a temporary installation. Remote enough to be undisturbed, accessible enough to be supplied, and empty enough that the presence of a single man would leave no trace once he departed. The timeline of the incident begins with Drummond's arrival on the morning of January 23rd. He had departed from his base in Hay River at dawn, flying a single-engine Cessna equipped with skis for landing on snow and ice. The flight took just under 2 hours. Weather conditions were clear. Visibility was good. He approached the station from the south, following the ridgeline as he had done on previous supply runs. From the air, the station appeared normal. The structures were intact. There was no visible damage. Smoke was not rising from the chimney, but this was not unusual. Morrow often conserved fuel by running the generator intermittently. Drummond circled once, then landed on a flat stretch of snow approximately 200 meters from the station. He taxied closer, shut down the engine, and climbed out. The silence was immediate and total. No wind, no movement. He called out. There was no response. He approached the main shelter and knocked on the door. When there was no answer, he opened it. The interior was cold. The generator had been off for some time. The temperature inside was only slightly warmer than outside. Drummond stepped in and looked around. Everything was in order. Too much in order, he would later say. It looked as though Morrow had simply stepped out and not returned. Drummond checked the logbook. The final entry, dated January 18th, offered no clues. He examined the shelves, the bunk, the workstation. Morrow's parka was hanging on its peg. His boots were on the floor. His gloves were folded on the desk. Drummond checked the auxiliary shed. The fuel canisters were full. The equipment was undisturbed. He returned to the main shelter and attempted to start the generator. It took several pulls, but it came to life. He powered on the radio and transmitted a message to the regional office. He reported that Morrow was missing and that there were no signs of struggle or distress. He was instructed to wait for further instructions. Drummond spent the next hour conducting a preliminary search of the immediate area. He walked the perimeter of the station, looking for tracks. The snow was windswept and hard-packed. Most prints had been erased, but he found a few faint impressions near the eastern edge of the ridge. They appeared to be boot prints, though they were degraded and difficult to follow. They led away from the station, descending the slope toward the basin. Drummond followed them for several hundred meters before they disappeared entirely. He returned to the station and waited. By mid-afternoon, he received confirmation that a search team would be dispatched. He was told to remain on site until they arrived. The search team reached the station 2 days later, on January 25th. It consisted of 4 men, 2 rangers from the Territorial Wildlife Service, a conservation officer, and a volunteer with experience in winter search and rescue. They brought additional supplies, camping equipment, and a second radio. The team established a base at the station and began a systematic search of the surrounding area. They divided the terrain into sectors and worked outward from the station in concentric circles. They used compasses and maps to maintain orientation. They marked their routes with flags. The search was slow and methodical. The landscape offered few clues. The snow was largely featureless. The wind had erased most surface details. They found occasional depressions that might have been tracks, but none led anywhere conclusive. On the second day of the search, one of the rangers discovered an object approximately 1 kilometer northeast of the station. It was a handheld radio, the type issued to field technicians. The casing was intact. The device appeared functional, though the battery was dead. It was lying on the surface of the snow, partially buried by drift. There was no indication of how it had come to be there. No tracks led to or from it. It was simply there, isolated and incongruous. The discovery of the radio prompted a more intensive search of the area. The team expanded their search radius and paid closer attention to anomalies in the snow. Over the next 3 days, they found several additional items. A pair of binoculars, half buried near the edge of the basin. A metal thermos, empty, lying on its side near a cluster of stunted spruce. A folded map, creased and weathered, caught against a rock outcrop nearly 2 kilometers west of the station. Each item was catalogued and photographed. None of them appeared damaged. None showed signs of having been discarded carelessly. They were simply present, distributed across a wide area with no apparent pattern. The search team attempted to construct a narrative from these findings. Perhaps Morrow had ventured out to conduct field measurements and had become disoriented. Perhaps he had dropped the items during a fall or a struggle. Perhaps he had been moving erratically, shedding equipment as he went. But none of these explanations accounted for the condition of the items or their distribution. The radio, for instance, would have been clipped to his belt or carried in a pocket. For it to be lying on the surface, undamaged, suggested it had been placed there, not dropped. The binoculars and thermos were similarly intact. There was no indication of distress or haste. On the 4th day of the search, the team made a more troubling discovery. Approximately 3 kilometers south of the station, near the shallow valley where the sparse spruce stands grew, they found a series of marks in the snow. The marks were not tracks exactly. They were more like disturbances, as though something had been dragged or had moved in a way that left irregular impressions. The patterns were inconsistent. In some places, they resembled shallow furrows. In others, they were merely depressions, broad and undefined. The team followed the marks for nearly half a kilometer. They led into the spruce stand, winding between the trees in a way that seemed deliberate but not rational. The marks did not follow a straight line. They looped and doubled back. At one point they formed a rough circle before continuing onward. The team documented the patterns with photographs and sketches. They attempted to determine what might have caused them. The consensus was unclear. One ranger suggested they might be the result of wind patterns interacting with the terrain. Another thought they could be animal tracks, degraded and distorted by subsequent snowfall. But no one was confident in these explanations. The marks were too regular to be entirely natural, yet too irregular to be the result of deliberate movement. Inside the spruce stand, the team found another object. It was a small notebook, bound in black vinyl, lying open on the snow. The pages were exposed to the elements, but the ink had not run. The notebook was not part of the standard issue equipment. It appeared to be personal. The entries inside were written in the same handwriting as the logbooks at the station. They were dated sporadically, beginning in mid-November and continuing through early January. The content was fragmentary. Most entries were brief observations about the landscape, the weather, the quality of the light. A few were longer, more reflective. One entry, dated December 9th, read, "The basin changes at night. Not in appearance, but in presence, as though something shifts beneath the surface. I do not know how to record this in the official logs." Another, dated December 27th, read, "The silence is not empty. It is full of something I cannot name. I've begun to hear it, or feel it, or something between the two. I'm not concerned, only curious." A final entry, dated January 14th, read, "I went to the edge today. Not the edge of the basin, but the edge of understanding. There is a boundary here, and I have been walking along it without knowing. I think I may have crossed it. The team expanded their search radius to 5 kilometers in all directions. They found no further items, no additional marks, no sign of Elias Morrow. On February 4th, the search was officially suspended. The weather was deteriorating, and the likelihood of finding Morrow alive had diminished to near zero. The team returned to their respective posts, and the case was turned over to the Regional Investigative Office. An official report was filed, summarizing the findings. The report noted the absence of a body. It noted the discovery of personal items distributed across a wide area. It noted the unexplained marks in the snow and the contents of the personal notebook. It concluded that Elias Morrow had left the station for reasons unknown and had not returned. The cause of his disappearance was listed as undetermined. The file was classified as open but inactive. No further searches were conducted. The formal investigation into the disappearance of Elias Morrow began in early February, after the suspension of the physical search. The lead investigator was a man named Harlan, a senior officer with the territorial police who had experience with remote wilderness cases. His role was not to conduct another search, but to review the evidence that had been collected and to interview anyone who might provide context. The case was unusual from the outset. There was no body, no witnesses, no clear indication of foul play. The evidence consisted of objects removed from their context and a written record that raised more questions than it answered. Harlan's approach was methodical. He began by reviewing the employment file of Elias Morrow. He contacted Morrow's employer, the Federal Land Survey Division, and requested copies of all correspondence and reports. He interviewed Drummond, the bush pilot, and obtained a detailed account of the supply runs and the condition of the station. He reached out to Keller and Voss, the other technicians stationed in the region, and asked them to describe their interactions with Morrow. He compiled a timeline of radio transmissions and cross-referenced it with weather data and flight logs. The goal was to construct a profile, not just of Morrow himself, but of the circumstances surrounding his disappearance. Drummond's testimony was straightforward. He described Morrow as professional and self-sufficient. He had never expressed dissatisfaction with the assignment or concern about the isolation. He had never requested additional supplies beyond what was scheduled. He had never mentioned any difficulties with the equipment or the environment. On his last visit, in early January, Morrow had been his usual self, quiet, focused, efficient. Drummond had noticed nothing unusual. The station had been in good order. The conversation had been brief and unremarkable. When asked whether Morrow had mentioned plans to conduct field work or to venture away from the station, Drummond said no. Morrow had not discussed his schedule or his intentions. Drummond had no reason to believe anything was wrong. He had departed without concern and had only learned of the disappearance when he returned for the next supply run. When asked about the condition of the station upon his return, Drummond emphasized the orderliness. Nothing was out of place. There was no sign of panic or haste. It was as though Morrow had simply stood up and walked out, intending to return shortly but never making it back. Keller, the technician stationed to the northeast, provided little additional information. His contact with Morrow had been minimal. They had exchanged radio messages every few days, mostly to confirm that systems were operational. He described Morrow as competent but distant. He had never met him in person. Their relationship, if it could be called that, was purely functional. Keller recalled their last conversation on January 16th. Morrow had reported normal conditions. His tone had been calm. There was no indication of distress or unusual circumstances. Keller had signed off without thinking anything of it. He had not attempted to contact Morrow again until after the search had begun. When asked whether Morrow had ever mentioned difficulties or concerns, Keller said no. The conversations were always brief and technical. They did not discuss personal matters. Voss, the technician to the southwest, echoed this account. He had not spoken to Morrow in over a week before the disappearance. His contact had been even less frequent than Keller's. He had no insights to offer. He had never noticed anything unusual in Morrow's communications. He had never heard anything in Morrow's voice that suggested trouble. Harlan also interviewed Morrow's supervisor, a man named Brennan, who worked out of the Yellowknife office. Brennan described Morrow as one of their most reliable field technicians. He had worked on multiple remote assignments without incident. He followed protocols. He submitted accurate reports. He never complained. Brennan had reviewed the data logs that Morrow had transmitted prior to his disappearance. They showed nothing unusual. The measurements were consistent with expectations. The equipment was functioning properly. There were no anomalies that would suggest equipment failure or environmental hazards. When asked about Morrow's personal life, Brennan admitted he knew very little. Morrow had been with the division for 6 years, but he kept to himself. He had no emergency contacts listed in his file. No next of kin. Brennan had assumed Morrow preferred solitude, which made him well suited for the work. He had never pressed for personal details, and Morrow had never volunteered them. Brennan expressed regret over the disappearance but offered no theories. He said that remote postings carried inherent risks and that despite precautions, accidents could happen. But he also acknowledged that the circumstances of Morrow's disappearance did not fit the profile of a typical accident. The personal notebook found in the spruce stand became a focal point of the investigation. Harlan read through the entries multiple times, attempting to discern a pattern or a progression. The early entries were unremarkable. Observations about the landscape, notes on weather patterns, brief reflections on the isolation. But as the weeks passed, the tone shifted. The entries became more introspective, more concerned with perception and presence. Morrow wrote about the basin as though it were not simply a geographic feature, but something with agency. He described the silence as having texture. He noted changes in the quality of light that did not correspond to weather conditions. He mentioned hearing things that were not sounds, seeing things that were not visible. The language was careful, almost scientific, as though he were attempting to document phenomena for which he had no vocabulary. Harlan consulted with a psychologist, asking whether the entries might indicate a deteriorating mental state. The psychologist reviewed the notebook and concluded that the writing did not suggest psychosis or delusion. The syntax was coherent. The observations were framed as questions rather than assertions. If anything, the entries reflected someone grappling with ambiguity, not someone losing touch with reality. One entry in particular drew Harlan's attention. It was dated January 10th, 8 days before Morrow's final log entry. It read, "I have begun to map what is not there. The official maps show the basin as empty, but it is not empty. There are structures beneath the snow, or the impression of structures. I have walked over them. They do not appear on any survey. I do not know what they are or when they were built. I have not reported this because I do not know how to describe it. But they are there." Harlan cross-referenced this entry with the official maps of the region. The maps showed no structures, historical or otherwise, in the area Morrow described. He contacted the Geological Survey Office and requested historical records. A search of the archives turned up a single reference to a trapper's cabin, reportedly located somewhere in the southern part of the basin, but the coordinates were vague, and the cabin was believed to have collapsed decades earlier. There was no mention of any other structures. Harlan made a note to conduct a follow-up search in the spring, after the snow melted, to determine whether there was any basis for Morrow's claim. The objects recovered during the search were also re-examined. The handheld radio, the binoculars, the thermos, the map. Each item was inspected for fingerprints, for damage, for any indication of how it had come to be where it was found. The analysis yielded nothing conclusive. The items bore Morrow's fingerprints as expected, but no others. There was no damage consistent with a fall or a struggle. The items appeared to have been set down, not dropped. The map, when unfolded, showed the basin and the surrounding region. Several locations were marked with small pencil dots. The dots did not correspond to known landmarks. Harlan attempted to visit the marked locations, but the coordinates were approximate and the terrain offered no distinguishing features. He found nothing at any of the sites, no structures, no disturbances, just empty snow. The marks in the snow, photographed and documented by the search team, were examined by a wildlife biologist. The biologist reviewed the images and concluded that the marks were not consistent with any known animal behavior. They were too irregular to be tracks and too deliberate to be entirely random. The biologist speculated that they might be the result of wind scouring combined with subtle variations in the snow density, but he acknowledged that this explanation was not entirely satisfactory. Harlan also reviewed the radio transmission logs from the regional office. The logs showed that Morrow had maintained regular contact through mid-January. His transmissions were brief and technical. On January 18th, his final transmission, he had reported normal conditions and signed off at the usual time. There had been no further contact. The regional office had not attempted to reach him again until Drummond reported his disappearance. Harlan noted that this was consistent with protocol. The technicians were not required to transmit daily, and the office did not monitor them continuously. It was assumed that they would report any issues. The absence of communication was not, in itself, considered unusual. Harlan questioned this assumption. He suggested that in future deployments, more frequent check-ins should be required, but he acknowledged that even daily contact would not have prevented what had occurred. Morrow had disappeared sometime between January 18th and January 23rd. The exact timing could not be determined. There was no evidence to suggest when he had left the station or what had prompted him to leave. The investigation concluded in late February with the filing of an official report. The report summarized the evidence and the testimony. It noted the absence of a body and the lack of any clear indication of foul play. It acknowledged the unusual distribution of personal items and the cryptic nature of the notebook entries. It concluded that Elias Morrow had left the monitoring station for reasons that could not be determined and had not returned. The report listed several possible explanations: exposure, disorientation, accident, voluntary departure. But it did not endorse any single theory. The cause of disappearance was officially classified as undetermined. The case remained open, pending the discovery of new evidence. Harlan appended a personal note to the file. In it, he wrote, "This is not a case that resolves itself through evidence. It is a case that exists in the space between evidence and explanation. Something occurred, but the nature of that occurrence eludes conventional investigation. I do not believe Elias Morrow simply wandered off and succumbed to the elements. The condition of the station, the distribution of the items, and the content of his notebook suggest something more deliberate. But I have no theory that accounts for all the facts." In the years following the disappearance, the case of Elias Morrow became a subject of quiet speculation. Among those familiar with northern wilderness incidents, it was not widely publicized. There were no media campaigns, no public appeals for information. The case existed primarily in the records of the territorial police and in the conversations of those who had been involved in the search or the investigation. Over time, several theories emerged, each attempting to impose structure on the evidence. None were entirely satisfactory. The first and most conventional theory was that Morrow had succumbed to exposure. The argument was straightforward. He had left the station either to conduct fieldwork or for some other reason and had become disoriented. The cold and the featureless terrain had worked against him. He had wandered, shedding equipment as hypothermia set in, until he collapsed. His body, buried under subsequent snowfall, had not been found during the search. This theory accounted for the basic facts: the disappearance, the scattered items, the absence of a body. But it struggled with the details. Morrow was experienced. He knew the risks. He had protocols. His winter gear had been left at the station, which made deliberate exposure unlikely. The items recovered were not consistent with the progression of hypothermia. They were intact, undamaged, distributed across a wide area with no clear path between them. If Morrow had been disoriented, the pattern should have been more erratic, more clustered. Instead, the items were spaced kilometers apart, as though placed deliberately. A second theory suggested voluntary departure. Perhaps Morrow had decided to leave the station and had walked out into the wilderness with the intention of disappearing. This theory was supported by the orderliness of the station. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was taken except presumably Morrow himself. The notebook entries, with their references to boundaries and edges, were interpreted as evidence of a man contemplating a break from his former life. Perhaps he had grown tired of the isolation, or had experienced some kind of epiphany and had chosen to walk away. This theory had a certain appeal. It explained the absence of struggle and the deliberate condition of the station. But it, too, had problems. Where would he have gone? The nearest settlement was over 100 kilometers away, and the terrain was unforgiving. Without his winter gear, survival would have been impossible. If he had intended to leave permanently, he would have taken supplies, or at least dressed appropriately. The scattered items suggested not departure, but disintegration, a gradual shedding of identity or purpose. And the notebook entries, while introspective, did not suggest despair or intent to vanish. They were curious, not conclusive. A third theory, more speculative, proposed that Morrow had encountered something unexpected. This theory was less specific. It suggested that he had come across another person, or persons, in the basin. Perhaps a trapper, or a group of travelers, or someone else working in the region unofficially. An encounter had occurred. It had gone wrong. Morrow had been harmed, or taken, or driven away. His body had been concealed, and the items had been scattered to create confusion. This theory accounted for the deliberate nature of the scene. It suggested intent, but it lacked supporting evidence. There were no tracks, no signs of other people, no reports of anyone else in the area. The basin was remote and inhospitable. The likelihood of a chance encounter was extremely low. And if foul play had occurred, why scatter the items at all? Why not simply leave the station as it was? The theory required assumptions that could not be verified. It introduced complexity without resolution. A fourth theory emerged from a closer reading of the notebook. It suggested that Morrow had become fixated on something he believed he had discovered in the basin. The references to structures, to boundaries, to the presence beneath the surface were interpreted as evidence of an obsession. Perhaps he had convinced himself that there was something hidden in the landscape, something significant. He had ventured out to investigate. He had become lost, not geographically, but conceptually, pursuing a question that had no answer. This theory positioned the disappearance as a kind of intellectual collapse, a dissolution of the self in the face of an unsolvable problem. It was appealing in its symmetry. It made the notebook central to the case, but it too was speculative. There was no evidence that Morrow had been obsessive. His official logs were consistent and unremarkable. The notebook was private, fragmentary. It did not constitute proof of mental deterioration. It was, at most, evidence of curiosity. And curiosity, no matter how intense, does not typically result in disappearance. A fifth theory, rarely voiced but occasionally considered, was that the landscape itself had played a role. This was not a supernatural explanation exactly, but an acknowledgement that the environment could exert pressures that were difficult to quantify. The isolation, the monotony, the sensory deprivation of a northern winter. These factors could alter perception. They could induce states of awareness that felt real but were not grounded in external reality. Perhaps Morrow had experienced something akin to a hallucination or a dissociative episode. He had perceived the basin as something other than it was. He had acted on that perception. He had walked into an imagined landscape and had not found his way back. This theory drew on research into isolation and sensory deprivation. It was known that prolonged exposure to monotonous environments could produce unusual psychological effects. But Morrow had been trained for such environments. He had worked in isolation before. There was no indication in his logs or his correspondence that he was struggling. The theory required an abrupt shift, a sudden break that left no warning signs. It was possible, but it felt incomplete. There were other theories, smaller and more fragmentary. Some suggested equipment failure, though no malfunctioning equipment had been found. Some suggested a medical emergency, though Morrow's health records showed no pre-existing conditions. Some suggested animal attack, though there were no signs of struggle or blood. Each theory addressed a portion of the evidence, but left other portions unexplained. The case resisted synthesis. It remained a collection of facts that did not cohere. Harlan, in his notes, wrote, "The problem is not that we lack theories. The problem is that every theory requires us to ignore something. The evidence does not point in a single direction. It points in all directions, and none." This is not a failure of investigation. It is a characteristic of the case itself. Some events do not resolve into narratives. They remain events, isolated and inexplicable. This observation, while not a theory, became a kind of unofficial conclusion. The disappearance of Elias Morrow was not a mystery in the sense that it awaited solution. It was a mystery in the sense that it resisted the very concept of solution. It existed, and it persisted, and it did not yield. In later years, a few individuals who had been involved in the search or the investigation returned to the basin. They were curious. They wanted to see the place again, to walk the terrain where Morrow had vanished. One of the rangers, a man named Dietrich, made a trip in the spring after the snow had melted. He walked the area where the marks had been found. He searched for the structures that Morrow had mentioned in his notebook. He found nothing. The ground was uneven, scarred by frost heave and erosion, but there were no structures, no foundations, no ruins, just rock and scrub and the faint depressions of long, dry watercourses. Dietrich later said that the basin felt different in the spring, less oppressive, more ordinary. But he also said that he understood, in some small way, what Morrow might have meant when he wrote about presence. There was a quality to the place, a kind of weight that was difficult to articulate. The case file on Elias Morrow remains open. It sits in an archive in Yellowknife, stored among other cold cases and unresolved incidents. The physical evidence, what little there is catalogued and preserved. The notebook, the radio, the binoculars, the thermos, the map. Each item is sealed in a plastic bag, labeled with a case number and a date. They are not examined regularly. They are not revisited. They exist as artifacts of an event that defies categorization. The file itself has grown thin over the years. New information has not been added. No witnesses have come forward. No body has been discovered. The case has settled into a kind of stasis, neither closed nor actively pursued. It is a record of absence, maintained not out of hope for resolution, but out of administrative obligation. Files once opened are not easily closed. They persist, like the events they document long after the possibility of closure has passed. The monitoring station where Morrow worked no longer exists. It was dismantled in late March of 1983, and the components were removed from the site. The generator, the radio equipment, the prefabricated shelter, all were loaded onto Drummond's plane and flown out in pieces. The site itself was left unmarked. There was no plaque, no memorial. The ridge where the station had stood returned to its original state, indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. By summer, the snow had melted and the grasses had grown back. By the following winter, there was no indication that anyone had ever been there. The basin absorbed the absence. It erased the presence. It continued as it always had, vast and indifferent. The other two monitoring stations were also dismantled. The land survey initiative that had established them was officially discontinued. The data collected during that winter was archived, but never analyzed in detail. The road that was meant to be built was never constructed. The region returned to its status as a blank space on maps, a designation without detail. Keller and Voss moved on to other assignments. They did not stay in touch. They did not speak of Morrow except when asked, and they were rarely asked. Drummond continued to fly supply runs to remote locations throughout the north. He occasionally thought about the day he found the station empty. He remembered the silence, the orderliness, the sense that something fundamental had been displaced. He never spoke about it publicly. It was not the kind of story that found an audience. It was too ambiguous, too devoid of resolution. When asked, years later, if he had any theories about what had happened, he said no. He said that the North was full of absences, places where people went and did not return. He said it was part of the landscape, as much as the trees and the rivers and the cold. He did not elaborate. Harlan retired from the territorial police in the early 1990s. He worked on hundreds of cases during his career, but he never forgot the Morrow file. It was, he later said, the case that taught him the limits of investigation. The idea that not every question has an answer and that some events exist solely as themselves, without explanation or context. He kept a copy of the notebook in his personal files. He read it occasionally, not searching for clues, but simply to remind himself of what Morrow had written, the careful observations, the quiet unease, the sense of standing at the edge of something that could not be named. The basin itself has not changed. It is still remote, still empty, still unmapped in any meaningful sense. It is visited rarely, usually by researchers conducting environmental surveys or by adventurers seeking isolation. Those who do visit describe it in similar terms: flat, featureless, silent. Some mention a sense of disorientation, even on clear days. Others describe a feeling of being watched, though they see nothing and hear nothing. These accounts are anecdotal. They are not documented. They are part of the oral folklore of the North, stories told around campfires or in bars, repeated and embellished until they lose their grounding in fact. The Morrow case occasionally surfaces in these stories. A man who disappeared. A station left empty. Items found scattered across kilometers, but the details are often wrong. The names are changed. The timeline is compressed. The story becomes a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of isolation and the unpredictability of the wilderness. It loses its specificity. It becomes myth. There have been a few attempts over the years to revisit the case. A journalist working on a piece about unsolved disappearances in the Canadian North contacted Harlan in the late 1980s. Harlan provided a summary of the investigation, but declined to be interviewed on the record. He said that the case did not lend itself to narrative. It was too fragmented, too resistant to interpretation. The journalist pursued it briefly, but eventually abandoned the project. A documentary filmmaker expressed interest in the early 2000s. He visited the basin and conducted interviews with some of those who had been involved in the search. But the footage was never edited into a completed film. The filmmaker later said that the material did not cohere. There was no arc, no climax, no resolution. The footage sat in storage and was eventually discarded. The case remains, in the end, what it has always been: a file, a collection of objects, a set of testimonies that do not align. It is a question without an answer, an event without a conclusion. The significance of the Morrow case, if it has significance, lies not in what it reveals, but in what it withholds. It is a reminder that the wilderness is not simply a setting. It is an active participant in the events that occur within it. It shapes perception. It imposes conditions. It resists explanation. The disappearance of Elias Morrow is not an anomaly. It is an example of a broader pattern, a recurring theme in the history of the North. People go into the wilderness and they do not return. Sometimes their bodies are found. Sometimes they are not. Sometimes there are clues. Sometimes there is only absence. The Morrow case is unusual only in the specificity of its details, the careful documentation of its evidence. But the fundamental nature of the event is not unique. It is part of the landscape's vocabulary, a language spoken in silence and erasure. The file remains open because closure is not possible. Because the questions it raises cannot be answered. Because the wilderness does not provide endings. It provides only continuations, the persistence of uncertainty, the enduring presence of the unknown. There is a photograph in the file, taken by one of the search team members. It shows the basin in late January, a vast expanse of white under a pale sky. In the foreground, barely visible, is the ridge where the monitoring station once stood. The image is stark, almost abstract. It could be anywhere. It could be nowhere. It is a landscape without reference, a place that exists only as geography. Somewhere in that image, though it cannot be seen, is the site where Elias Morrow was last known to have been. Somewhere beyond the frame is the path he took, if he took a path. Somewhere in that emptiness is the answer to what occurred, if an answer exists. But the photograph does not reveal it. It shows only the basin, silent and enduring. The file will remain open.